The transport ship Meridian's hope shuddered as it descended through the atmospheric layers of Draconum Prime, the capital world of the Zephyrian Empire. Elena Martinez pressed her face against the small porthole, watching as massive spires of crystalline metal pierced through clouds that shimmered with unnatural colors. The planet's 3 moons hung in the sky like watchful eyes, each one bearing the scars of ancient battles that had shaped the Empire's bloody rise to power. "First time on an Imperial world?" asked the transport pilot, a grizzled Kethri whose scaled hands moved across the control panel with practiced ease. His species had served the Empire for nearly 2 millennia, ever since their homeworld had been conquered and their people enslaved. "Yes," Elena replied, adjusting the simple brown dress that marked her as domestic staff. The fabric felt rough against her skin, a far cry from the comfortable clothes she'd worn during her years as a teacher on Earth's outer colonies. But those days were gone, lost along with everything else when the hegemony had stripped her teaching license for inappropriate sympathetic instruction toward alien perspectives. The pilot's laugh was bitter. Advice from someone who's seen too many servants come and go. Keep your head down, speak only when spoken to, and never, ever look directly at the Emperor. Most humans who work in the palace don't last more than a few months before requesting transfer or simply disappearing. Elena's stomach tightened. She'd heard whispers about the Emperor during her long journey from Earth. Zephyros the Destroyer, the last dragon, the golden tyrant who had unified a dozen star systems under his iron rule. Stories spoke of his rage that could melt steel, his roar that could shatter minds, and his terrible beauty that drove lesser beings mad. But she'd also heard something else, something the official reports never mentioned. Servants spoke in hushed voices about strange sounds that echoed through the palace at night, sounds that almost seemed like weeping. The ship touched down at the Imperial spaceport with barely a tremor, testament to Kethri piloting skills. Through the porthole, Elena could see the massive structure that dominated the horizon, the Obsidian Palace. It rose from the planet's surface like a mountain of black glass and gold, its towers reaching so high they disappeared into the upper atmosphere. Energy shields shimmered around its perimeter, and she could just make out the tiny shapes of patrol craft circling its boundaries like mechanical vultures. Elena Martinez, human designation 74A. A voice called out as she disembarked. She turned to see a tall, elegant creature approaching. Definitely not human, but close enough that the differences were subtle. Pointed ears, slightly elongated features, and eyes that held an otherworldly luminescence. This had to be one of the Etherean noble class, the Emperor's closest advisors. "That's me," Elena said, shouldering her small travel bag. The Etherean looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "I am Counselor Valdris, Chief Administrator of Imperial Domestic Affairs. You are to be assigned to the Emperor's personal quarters as maintenance staff. I trust you understand the sensitivity of this position." Elena nodded, though she felt a chill run down her spine. Personal quarters meant she would be working in close proximity to the most feared being in known space. Valdris led her through a series of transportation tubes that carried them swiftly toward the palace. As they traveled, he began what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech about palace protocols. "The Emperor maintains a strict schedule," Valdris explained, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "He rises at dawn, reviews military reports until midday, holds court for diplomatic affairs in the afternoon, and retires to his private chambers at sunset. Your duties will be to maintain cleanliness in his personal spaces during the hours when he is occupied elsewhere. You will never, under any circumstances, encounter him directly." The transportation tube emerged from underground, and Elena gasped despite herself. They were now traveling through the palace itself, and the scale was overwhelming. Corridors stretched away in every direction, their walls adorned with crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with inner light. Servants of dozens of different species scurried about their duties, all keeping their eyes carefully downcast. "The Emperor's quarters occupy the highest tower," Valdris continued. "You will access them through the service lifts only. The main levels are forbidden to domestic staff. Your cleaning duties will include the sleeping chamber, the bathing pools, the meditation garden, and the observation deck. You will work quickly and efficiently, leaving no trace of your presence. They stepped off the transport into a service bay filled with supplies and equipment. Elena was given a small device that looked like a cross between a tablet and a bracelet, her work scheduler and access key. The schedule displayed was precise. 6 hours each day, starting 2 hours after dawn, cleaning the Emperor's private spaces while he attended to imperial business. One more thing, Valdris said, his luminescent eyes fixing on Elena with uncomfortable intensity. The Emperor values his privacy above all else. If you hear anything, see anything, or encounter anything unusual during your duties, you are to report to no one. The walls of this palace have sensors, but they can be selective in what they record. Some sounds, some sights, are meant to remain private. Do I make myself clear? Elena felt a chill of understanding. He was talking about the weeping. Crystal clear, sir. Valdris nodded curtly and handed her off to a human supervisor named Marcus, a middle-aged man whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and learned to see nothing at all. Follow me, Marcus said simply. I'll show you to your quarters and explain the daily routine. The servant levels of the palace were a stark contrast to the grandeur above. Here, the corridors were narrow and functional, lit by harsh artificial light that cast everything in shades of gray. Elena's room was small, but adequate. A bed, a desk, a small bathroom, and a window that looked out over the palace grounds. You'll get used to it, Marcus said, noticing her expression. The Emperor pays well, and the work isn't physically demanding. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine. That evening, Elena lay in her narrow bed and stared up at the ceiling. Somewhere far above her, in the highest tower of the palace, was the being that ruled over trillions of souls. She'd studied the official histories during her journey. Zephyros had conquered his first world at the age of 200, expanded his empire through 3 brutal wars, and hadn't been successfully challenged in over 1,000 years. Dragons lived for millennia and grew stronger with age. At 3,000 years old, Zephyros was approaching the peak of his power. But as she drifted towards sleep, Elena heard it, faint but unmistakable, carried down through the ventilation systems of the massive structure. It was a sound of such profound sadness that it made her heart ache. The sound of someone crying as if their soul was breaking apart piece by piece. She sat up in bed, listening. The sound continued for nearly an hour before fading away, leaving only silence and the gentle hum of the palace's life support systems. Elena had worked with traumatized children in her teaching career. She'd comforted students who had lost families in colonial wars, who had been displaced by economic collapse, who had suffered abuse at the hands of those meant to protect them. She knew the sound of pain that had been held inside too long, of grief that had nowhere to go, of loneliness so complete it consumed everything else. And she had never, not once, been able to simply ignore it. The next morning came too soon. Elena reported to the service bay, where Marcus was waiting with a cart full of cleaning supplies. The equipment was far more advanced than anything she'd used on the colony worlds. Sonic cleaners that could remove dirt at the molecular level, sanitizers that eliminated all traces of organic contamination, and polishing tools that could restore any surface to perfect condition. Remember, Marcus said as they entered the service lift, work quickly and quietly. The Emperor's schedule is precise, but sometimes he returns early. If you hear the transport approaching, stop whatever you're doing and use the emergency exit. The last thing any of us want is for you to surprise him. The lift rose through the heart of the palace, past floors dedicated to military command, diplomatic chambers, and administrative offices. Elena caught glimpses of vast rooms filled with holographic displays showing star maps, fleet positions, and real-time communications from across the Empire. The scale of it was overwhelming. This single building coordinated the activities of thousands of worlds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lift stopped, and the doors opened onto a small anteroom. Marcus led her through a series of security checkpoints, each one scanning her thoroughly before allowing passage. Then, at last, they stood before a simple door marked only with a small symbol, a dragon in flight, surrounded by stars. "This is it," Marcus said, activating the door with Elena's new access key. "You'll be working alone up here. I'll check on you once each day, but otherwise, you're on your own. Good luck." The door slid open, and Elena stepped into the private realm of the most powerful being in the galaxy. Her first impression was surprise. She'd expected something grandiose, golden decorations, massive furniture, displays of wealth and power. Instead, she found herself in a space that was almost monastery-like in its simplicity. The walls were made of some kind of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Furniture was minimal and functional. There were no decorations, no art, no personal items of any kind. But the view was incredible. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the capital city and beyond to the curve of the planet's horizon and the star-filled void beyond. From this height, Elena could see the entire scope of the Empire's heart world. Cities that stretched to the horizon, orbital elevators reaching toward the stars, and the constant stream of ships arriving and departing. She began her work methodically, starting with the sleeping chamber. The bed was enormous, clearly designed for someone much larger than a human, but it looked barely used. The sheets were twisted and tangled, as if the occupant had spent hours tossing and turning. There were strange dark stains on the pillowcase that took several applications of the sonic cleaner to remove. As she worked, Elena found herself building a mental picture of the Emperor's life based on the small details she observed. The meditation garden was clearly used regularly. The plants were well tended, and the stone benches showed signs of frequent occupation. But there were strange marks in the stone, as if something with claws had gripped the benches so tightly they'd left permanent gouges. The bathing pools were another puzzle. They were clearly designed for relaxation, filled with warm, mineral-rich water that would have been incredibly luxurious. But the water was always cold and unused, and there were scratch marks around the edges, as if someone had gripped them in pain or frustration. Most telling of all was the observation deck. This was clearly where the Emperor spent most of his private time. The space was large and open, with comfortable seating arranged to take advantage of the spectacular view. But Elena found something that made her heart ache. Scattered around one particular chair were small, crystalline formations. At first, she thought they might be some kind of decoration, but closer examination revealed the truth. They were dried tears, crystallized by exposure to the dry atmosphere of the chamber. Dragons, it seemed, cried tears of crystal. Over the following days, Elena fell into a routine. She would arrive each morning, clean the Emperor's quarters with meticulous care, and leave before his schedule brought him back to his private spaces. But each day, she found more evidence of the profound sadness that seemed to permeate every corner of his life. The scratch marks in the stone grew deeper. The crystalline tears accumulated faster than she could clean them. The bed sheets were increasingly tangled, and sometimes she found they had been torn by what could only be claws. But it was on her 5th day that Elena discovered something that changed everything. While cleaning the meditation garden, she noticed a small alcove she had somehow missed before. Inside, sitting on a simple stone shelf, was a single item that didn't belong to the austere decor of the rest of the quarters. It was a small, clearly handmade doll. The craftsmanship was crude but lovingly done, stitched together from scraps of bright fabric with button eyes and yarn hair. It was the kind of toy a child might make, or that someone might create for a beloved child. The doll was worn smooth in places, as if it had been held countless times. And it was damp with fresh tears. Elena stared at the little toy for a long time, her heart breaking as she began to understand. Somewhere in the vast, cold palace of the most feared being in the galaxy, there lived someone who still kept a child's doll close enough to cry over. She carefully cleaned around the alcove without disturbing the doll, but the image stayed with her for the rest of the day. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sound of weeping that drifted down from the tower above, Elena made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to find out who had made that doll, and why it meant so much to the Emperor that he kept it close enough to water with his tears. But more than that, she was going to do something that every instinct and every rule told her was impossible. She was going to try to help. Elena spent the next 3 days researching everything she could find about Emperor Zephyros. The palace's servant quarters had a small library terminal that provided access to historical records, though she suspected much of it was heavily censored. Still, she managed to piece together fragments of his story. Born on the dying world of Pyros, Zephyros had been the last of his kind, even before his empire began. Dragons had once been numerous, ruling over scattered star systems in small family groups. But a plague, something the records called the Silent Death, had swept through their populations 3 millennia ago. Unlike other species that might succumb quickly, dragons were too strong to die easily. Instead, they had lingered for decades, watching their loved ones waste away one by one. Zephyros had been barely past adolescence when he watched his parents, his siblings, and, finally, his mate and newly hatched daughter die in his arms. The records were sparse about what happened next, but Elena could read between the lines. A young dragon, driven mad by grief and entirely alone in the universe, had carved out an empire through sheer force of will and devastating power. Every conquest had been an attempt to fill the void where his family should have been. The doll made terrible sense now. It had belonged to his daughter. Elena's research was interrupted on the 4th day by an unexpected encounter. She was cleaning the observation deck when she heard the soft hiss of the main door opening. Panic shot through her. The Emperor wasn't supposed to return for another 2 hours. She looked around frantically for the emergency exit, but she was too far away to reach it without being seen. "I know you're there," came a voice like distant thunder. "I can smell your fear." Elena froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Slowly, she turned around. Emperor Zephyros stood in the doorway, and Elena's first thought was that all the stories had been completely inadequate. He was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful, terrible and awesome, and completely beyond human comprehension. His form was primarily humanoid, but stretched and refined, nearly 8 feet tall with features that spoke of both nobility and predatory power. His scales caught the light like burnished gold, and his eyes were like looking into molten amber. But what struck Elena most was not his imposing presence or his obvious power. It was the exhaustion that hung around him like a cloak. This was a being that had been tired for longer than human civilization had existed. "You're the new cleaning servant," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Human." Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, your Imperial Majesty." To her surprise, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Imperial Majesty. Do you have any idea how many billions of beings have spoken those words? How many have knelt before me, trembling, offering tribute, or begging for mercy?" She didn't know what to say to that, so she remained silent. Zephyros moved into the room, and Elena was struck by how quietly he walked despite his size. His movements were fluid, controlled, speaking of centuries of combat training and natural grace. "You know what the interesting thing is?" he continued, moving toward the chair where Elena had found so many crystalline tears. "They all assume they know what they're looking at when they see me. They see the conqueror, the destroyer, the tyrant. They see their nightmares made flesh." He settled into the chair, and Elena noticed that his hands, clawed and powerful as they were, gripped the armrests with a gentleness that suggested he was constantly aware of his own strength. "But you," he said, those amber eyes fixing on her with uncomfortable intensity. "You've been cleaning my private spaces for over a week. You've seen things that no other being in this empire has been allowed to see. So tell me, little human, what do you see when you look at me?" Elena knew she should stay silent. She knew she should bow her head and beg forgiveness and hope that he would let her live. But the same instinct that had made her a good teacher, the same compassion that had cost her everything when she defended alien students against human prejudice, wouldn't let her look away from pain when she saw it. "I see someone who's very tired," she said quietly. "Someone who's been alone for a very long time." The silence that followed was so profound that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Zephyros stared at her as if she had said something in a language he didn't recognize. "Alone," he repeated finally. "Yes, I suppose that's accurate. Do you know how long it's been since anyone spoke to me without fear in their voice?" Elena shook her head. "Neither do I. It's been centuries at least, perhaps longer." He looked out the massive windows toward the stars. "Do you want to know a secret, little human? The empire that spans a dozen star systems, the fleets that could shatter planets, the armies that could conquest entire species. All of it exists because I was afraid to stop moving. Because the moment I stop conquering, stop expanding, stop pushing forward, I have to think about why I'm doing any of this. And why are you doing it?" Elena asked softly. His laugh was bitter. Because if I build something large enough, strong enough, maybe it will fill the space where everyone I loved used to be. Because if I keep busy enough, maybe I won't hear their voices calling to me in the night. Because if I become powerful enough, maybe I can protect something precious again, even though there's nothing left to protect. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought of the small doll hidden in the meditation garden, of the crystalline tears scattered around this chair, of the sound of weeping that echoed through the palace every night. You had a daughter, she said. The change in Zephyros was immediate and terrifying. His eyes flared with golden light, and the temperature in the room seemed to spike. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the windows vibrate. How do you know that? Elena forced herself not to step back, though every instinct screamed at her to run. I found her doll in the meditation garden. I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping, I was just cleaning and... You touched it? The words came out like a roar, and Elena could see actual flames dancing at the corners of his mouth. No, she said quickly. I would never. I could see it meant something to you. I cleaned around it. The fire in his eyes dimmed slightly. You didn't report it to the administrators. You didn't ask questions. You just cleaned around it. It wasn't my business to report, Elena said. And I could see it was important to you. Personal. Zephyros stared at her for a long moment, and Elena had the strange sensation that he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Her name was Lyralii, he said finally, his voice so quiet Elena had to strain to hear it. She was going to be magnificent. Dragons don't mature until their 3rd century, but she was already showing such promise, such intelligence, such curiosity about the world. She wanted to know everything. How stars were born, why water flowed downhill, what made flowers grow. His hands tightened on the chair arms, and Elena heard the stone crack slightly under his grip. The plague took her slowly. Dragons are strong, you see. We don't die easily. So I got to watch, helpless, as she wasted away over the course of 20 years. 20 years of watching my daughter fade a little more each day, knowing that all my power, all my strength, couldn't save the one thing in the universe that mattered to me. Tears were flowing freely down Elena's face now. How old was she when she died? 37 years old. Still a child by our standards. She made that doll herself during the last year, when she was too weak to do much else. Said it was practice for when she had babies of her own someday. His voice broke on the last word. She never got to grow up. Never got to see the star she was so curious about. Never got to become the magnificent being I knew she could be. Elena found herself moving closer to him without consciously deciding to do so. Every rational part of her mind was screaming warnings, but she couldn't stop herself. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I can't imagine losing a child like that. No, Zephyros said, you can't. Because humans live such brief lives, you compress your pain into smaller spaces. You grieve intensely, but briefly because you have to. You don't have centuries to spend drowning in sorrow. But dragons, we remember everything. Every detail. Every moment. The way she laughed. The way she smelled. The weight of her in my arms when she was small enough for me to hold her. He looked directly at Elena again. Do you know what the worst part is? She shook her head. I'm forgetting. After 3,000 years, the memories are starting to fade. Her voice isn't as clear as it used to be. I can't remember exactly what her scales looked like in the sunlight. And someday, probably soon, I'll wake up and realize that I can't remember her face. Elena felt something break inside her chest. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her small human hand on his massive, clawed one. The effect was electric. Zephyros stared down at their joined hands as if he'd never seen anything like it before. Elena realized with a start that he probably hadn't. When was the last time anyone had touched him voluntarily? When was the last time anyone had offered him comfort instead of demanding protection or conquest? She must have been amazing, Elena said softly, to inspire such love, to be missed so deeply for so long. He whispered, she was everything good about dragons, everything noble we could be. And when she died, that part of me died with her. They sat in silence for a long time, Elena's small hand resting on his. She could feel the warmth radiating from his scales, could sense the barely contained power that could level mountains. But she could also feel something else, a profound loneliness that had been eating at him for longer than human civilization had existed. "Your Imperial Majesty," came a voice from the doorway. Elena spun around to see Counselor Valdres standing there, his luminescent eyes wide with shock and what looked like terror. "I was told you had returned early. I came to ensure that the cleaning staff wasn't disturbing you." The temperature in the room plummeted as Zephyros withdrew his hand and turned his attention to the Etherean administrator. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "The cleaning staff is performing adequately. You may go." Valdres's gaze flicked between Elena and the Emperor, and she could see him trying to process what he was seeing. A human servant who had not only survived a direct encounter with Zephyros, but had apparently been talking to him. "Of course, Your Imperial Majesty. Shall I arrange for alternative cleaning staff? Perhaps someone more experienced?" "No," Zephyros said firmly. "This one will continue her duties as assigned." Elena watched the brief exchange with growing understanding. Valdres wasn't just surprised. He was afraid. Not of the Emperor, but of what Elena's survival might mean. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for, a potential disruption to the carefully maintained order of the palace. After Valdres left, Zephyros turned back to Elena. "You should go," he said quietly. "Finish your duties and return to your quarters. And, Elena, thank you for listening. It's been a long time since anyone has done that." Elena nodded and gathered her cleaning supplies, but as she reached the door, she turned back. "Your Imperial Majesty?" "Yes. Your daughter, Lyralii. What was her favorite thing? What made her happiest?" Zephyros was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said stories. She loved stories about brave heroes and distant worlds and happy endings. She was always asking me to tell her tales about the old days, before the plague, when dragons lived in family groups and raised their young together. Elena smiled despite her tears. She sounded wonderful. She was. That night, Elena lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. She could hear the sound of weeping drifting down from the tower above, but now it carried a different weight. Now she knew exactly who was crying and why, and how long they had been alone with their grief. She thought about the stories Lyralii had loved, about brave heroes and happy endings. She thought about a little dragon child who had made a doll while dying slowly of plague, who had dreamed of seeing the stars and raising babies of her own. And she thought about her father, 3,000 years dead, who still mourned her so deeply that he cried crystalline tears every night. Elena had always been good at telling stories. It had made her a popular teacher before everything went wrong. She wondered if dragons appreciated good stories as much as human children did. More importantly, she wondered if anyone had ever told Emperor Zephyros that grief wasn't meant to be carried alone. As she drifted towards sleep, Elena found herself planning. She was already breaking every rule by surviving her encounter with the Emperor. What would happen if she broke a few more? What would happen if, instead of hiding from the sound of his crying, she decided to do something about it? The next morning, Elena arrived at the Emperor's quarters with her usual cleaning supplies, but also with something else, a small book of human stories she'd brought from Earth. Stories about heroes who overcame impossible odds, about families reunited against all hope, about love that transcended death itself. She cleaned as usual, working efficiently and quietly. But when she reached the meditation garden, she carefully placed the book on the stone shelf next to Lyralii's doll. If Zephyros noticed it, he gave no sign. But that night, the weeping from the tower above seemed somehow less desperate, less alone. And Elena smiled as she fell asleep, already planning what story she might share next. 2 weeks passed before Elena saw the Emperor again. During that time, she had continued her routine of leaving small gifts in the meditation garden. Sometimes stories, sometimes small drawings she'd made during her free time, once a pressed flower from the palace grounds. Each item was different, but they all shared one common theme: hope. She never knew if he found them meaningful until the day she arrived to discover that her book of human stories had been moved. It now sat open to a particular tale. The story of a father who had lost his daughter, but found her again in the kindness he showed to other children who needed guidance. Someone had been reading it. Elena was working in the observation deck, carefully collecting the crystalline tears that had accumulated around the Emperor's chair when she heard his approach. This time, she didn't panic. Instead, she simply continued her work until he spoke. The story about the father and the lost daughter, he said without preamble. Did you choose it specifically? Elena looked up to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with those incredible amber eyes. Today he seemed different, still impossibly powerful, still carrying that aura of barely contained force, but somehow less isolated. I thought you might relate to it, she said honestly. Sometimes the stories that hurt the most are the ones we need to hear. The human in the story finds peace by helping other children, by becoming a teacher and guide to those who have lost their own fathers. Elena nodded. Sometimes we honor the dead best by living in a way they would have wanted us to live. Zephyros entered the room and settled into his chair. Elena noticed that he moved the crystalline tears aside gently, almost reverently, before sitting down. Tell me about yourself. Elena, he said. How does a human end up working as a servant in my palace? Elena hesitated. Her story wasn't exactly flattering to the imperial bureaucracy. I was a teacher, she said finally, on one of the outer colony worlds. I taught children from multiple species, humans, Ketheri, Zelani, even a few young Etherians whose families had settled there. And the colonial administration decided that teaching alien children alongside human children was inappropriate. They said I was showing too much sympathy for non-human perspectives, that I was undermining human cultural supremacy. Elena's voice grew bitter. They revoked my teaching license and blacklisted me from educational work. Domestic service was the only job I could find that would allow me to travel off-world. Zephyros was quiet for a long moment. You lost your career because you treated alien children with kindness. I lost my career because I refused to teach human children that they were inherently superior to everyone else, Elena corrected. Because I wouldn't tell a 6-year-old Ketheri that his dreams mattered less than a human child's dreams. And you don't regret this choice? Elena thought about her former students, bright, curious children from a dozen different species, all eager to learn and grow and discover their places in the universe. She thought about the Zelani girl who had written beautiful poetry, the Ketheri boy who had shown genuine mathematical genius, the little Etherian whose questions about stellar formation had challenged even Elena's advanced knowledge. No, she said firmly, I don't regret it. Children are children, regardless of what species they belong to. They all deserve to be nurtured and encouraged and loved. Zephyros leaned forward slightly. Even the children of those you consider enemies? Elena met his gaze steadily. Especially then, children don't choose their parents' conflicts. They shouldn't suffer for wars they didn't start. Fascinating, he murmured. You know, in 3,000 years of ruling, you're the first human I've met who has expressed that sentiment. Then, you've been talking to the wrong humans. Another long silence. Then, to Elena's surprise, Zephyros laughed. A real laugh, not the bitter sound she'd heard before. Perhaps I have, he said. Tell me, what did you teach? What subjects? Literature and history, primarily, but also basic ethics, cultural appreciation, and creative writing. I believed that understanding other perspectives made better citizens. Literature and history, he repeated thoughtfully. Two of my daughter's favorite subjects. She was always asking about the old stories, the legends from before the plague. She wanted to understand how we had lived, what we had valued, what we had lost. Elena set down her cleaning supplies and gave him her full attention. What were the old dragon stories like? Different from human tales, Zephyros said, and there was a wistful quality to his voice. Dragons lived for millennia, so our stories spanned vast time frames. We told tales of heroes whose quests lasted centuries, of love affairs that endured across galactic ages, of wisdom gained through experiences no shorter-lived species could accumulate. They sound beautiful. They were. They spoke of a time when dragons were not solitary conquerors, but members of extended family groups. When our strength was used to protect rather than dominate. When our longevity allowed us to be guardians and teachers rather than tyrants. Elena leaned forward slightly. Could you tell me one? I'd love to hear a real dragon story. Zephyros looked at her with something that might have been surprise. You would want to hear such a thing? Of course. Stories are windows into the soul of a culture. They tell us what a people value, what they dream of, what they fear. Dragon stories would be unlike anything in human literature. For a moment, Elena thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. There was once a dragon named Corvanes the Wise, who lived in the time before memory. He was not the strongest of his kind, nor the most beautiful, but he possessed something rarer than either strength or beauty: infinite patience. Corvanes made his home on a world that was dying. Its sun was growing cold, its plants were withering, and its people, a small, peaceful species called the Lumina, faced extinction. Other dragons advised him to leave, to find a more prosperous world to guard. But Corvanes saw something in the Lumina that others missed. For 300 years, he worked alongside them. He used his flame to warm their cities when the sun grew dim. He carried their ships to distant worlds to trade for resources they needed. He taught them to build great mirrors that could capture and focus what little sunlight remained. But most importantly, he listened to their stories. Every night, the Lumina would gather and share tales of their ancestors, their dreams, their hopes for the future. And Corvanes, who could have demanded tribute or obedience, simply sat and listened. When the sun finally died, the Lumina were ready. They had learned to create their own light, their own warmth, their own hope. They survived the death of their star and went on to build a new civilization among the distant worlds. And Corvanes? He stayed with them, not as their ruler, but as their friend. For the remaining 2,000 years of his life, he was known not as Corvanes the Conqueror or Corvanes the Destroyer, but simply as Corvanes the Wise, the dragon who understood that true strength lies in helping others become stronger. Elena sat in stunned silence for a moment. The story was beautiful, haunting, and utterly unlike the tales of conquest and domination she had expected from imperial culture. "That's remarkable," she said finally. "It's about cooperation, sacrifice, patience, all the things that make civilizations thrive rather than merely survive." "Yes," Zephyros said quietly. "It was the kind of story my daughter loved best. She used to say that when she grew up, she wanted to be like Corvanes, strong enough to help others, wise enough to know when strength wasn't the answer." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again. "She would have been an amazing leader. She would have been better than me," Zephyros said with absolute certainty. "I built an empire through conquest and fear. She would have built something through compassion and wisdom." Elena looked around the austere chamber, at the evidence of profound loneliness and grief, at the crystalline tears that spoke of 3 millennia of mourning. An idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, probably insane, but potentially transformative. "Your Imperial Majesty," she said carefully, "what if she still could?" Zephyros went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if there was a way to honor her memory by becoming the kind of ruler she would have wanted to be? What if instead of building an empire through conquest, you used your power to protect and nurture and teach?" The silence that followed was so profound that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. When Zephyros finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Elena, I have conquered 12 star systems. I command fleets that could shatter worlds. Trillions of beings bow before my power. The empire I have built spans half the galaxy. You're suggesting that I what? Simply change the fundamental nature of everything I've created. I'm suggesting that maybe it's not too late to start building the empire your daughter would have wanted to see." "And how exactly would one go about transforming a military dictatorship into some kind of benevolent protectorate?" Elena took a deep breath. "You start small. You find places where your strength can protect instead of conquer. You look for species like the Lumina in your story, people who need help rather than domination. You use your longevity not to accumulate power, but to accumulate wisdom. And you think this would honor her memory? I think she would be proud to see her father become the dragon from the story she loved." Zephyros stood and walked to the massive windows, looking out at the empire he had built through blood and fire. Elena watched him, hardly daring to breathe. She had just suggested that the most powerful being in known space should fundamentally change everything he had spent 3 millennia creating. "There would be resistance," he said finally. "The military commanders, the noble houses, the bureaucrats who profit from the current system. They would see any change as weakness. Then, you help them understand that protecting is stronger than conquering, Elena said. You show them that an empire built on loyalty is more stable than one built on fear. And if they refuse to learn? Elena thought of her former students, of the children she had taught from a dozen different species. Then, you remember that the future belongs to the next generation, not to those who cling to old ways. You find the young ones who still believe in possibilities, and you teach them to be better than their predecessors. Zephyros turned back to her, and Elena saw something in his amber eyes that hadn't been there before, a tiny spark of what might have been hope. You would really suggest that an emperor who has ruled through fear for 3,000 years could simply choose to be different? I would suggest that a father who has mourned his daughter for 3,000 years might want to create the kind of world she dreamed of living in. Another long silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "She would have liked you, I think. You have the same stubborn optimism she had. The same belief that broken things can be fixed if you just care enough." Elena felt tears flowing down her cheeks. "I would have loved to meet her." "So would I," Zephyros said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day, for 3,000 years, I have wished I could meet the adult she would have become, the leader she would have been, the dragon she would have grown into." He looked at Elena for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation that he was seeing not just her, but something else, a possibility he had never allowed himself to imagine. "Elena," he said finally, "would you be willing to help me with something?" "Of course. Anything. I want to try something different. Something that honors her memory in the way you suggested. But I'll need advice. I'll need someone who understands what it means to teach and guide and nurture. Someone who has already sacrificed their own comfort to protect children they barely knew." Elena's heart began to race. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you would be willing to become something more than my cleaning servant. I'm asking if you would help me learn how to be the kind of ruler my daughter would have wanted me to be." Elena stared at him in stunned silence. Then, without hesitation, she said, "Yes. Absolutely yes." Zephyros smiled, the first truly warm expression she had seen from him. And, for just a moment, Elena could see past the power and the grief to the father who had once told bedtime stories to a little dragon who dreamed of helping others. "Then, we begin tomorrow," he said. "And Elena? Thank you. For the first time in 3,000 years, I have something to look forward to." That night, the sound of weeping from the tower above was different. Softer, less desperate. And, mixed in with the tears, Elena could swear she heard something else. The sound of someone quietly telling stories in a language she didn't recognize, stories that spoke of hope and healing and new beginnings. The transformation began quietly, in ways that most of the imperial court wouldn't notice for months. Elena's official title was changed from domestic maintenance staff to cultural advisor, a position that didn't exist in the imperial hierarchy and therefore raised fewer questions than personal counselor to the emperor might have. She was given quarters in the administrative levels of the palace, close enough to the emperor's tower to be summoned quickly, but far enough from the servant levels to avoid uncomfortable questions from her former colleagues. The quarters were larger and more comfortable than anything she'd ever had, but Elena barely noticed the luxury. Her attention was focused entirely on the impossible task ahead of her. "The first thing we need to understand," Elena said during one of their early morning meetings, "is that change this fundamental can't happen overnight. You've been ruling through fear and military might for 3,000 years. People don't just forget that because you decide to be different." They were in the emperor's private study, a room Elena had never cleaned before because it was always occupied during her working hours. Like the rest of his quarters, it was surprisingly simple. Shelves filled with military reports and star charts, a desk made of some kind of dark wood, chairs designed for comfort rather than intimidation. The only decoration was a small crystal formation near one of the windows, crystalline tears that had been carefully preserved rather than cleaned away. Zephyros nodded thoughtfully. "I've been considering this problem. The military commanders expect strength and decisiveness. The noble houses expect continued expansion and profitable conquests. The bureaucrats expect the status quo that has made them wealthy and powerful. If I simply announce that we're changing our fundamental approach to governance, they'll see it as weakness and try to remove you," Elena finished. "Or worse, they'll assume you're testing them and become even more aggressive to prove their loyalty. Exactly. So we need to find a way to demonstrate strength while gradually shifting toward protection and guidance. Elena had been thinking about this problem for days. What if we start with a crisis? Something that lets you demonstrate that protecting can be more powerful than conquering. What kind of crisis? Elena pulled out a data pad showing reports she'd been studying. I've been looking through the Imperial intelligence files you gave me access to. There are dozens of situations throughout the Empire where your intervention could make a real difference. Planets facing natural disasters, species threatened by disease, colonies struggling with resource shortages. She highlighted several entries. Here, the Thylaxi system, their primary agricultural world, is facing a blight that's destroying their food crops. The local governors have been requesting aid for months, but the requests keep getting lost in bureaucracy because the Thylaxi aren't strategically important enough to warrant attention. Zephyros leaned forward, studying the reports. What kind of aid are they requesting? Mostly technical assistance and emergency food supplies. But their real problem is deeper than that. Their agricultural methods are outdated. Their population is growing faster than their food production capacity, and they're trapped in an economic system that keeps them perpetually dependent on imperial charity. So a traditional imperial response would be to provide just enough aid to keep them functional, ensuring their continued dependence. Right. But what if instead you arrived personally, brought not just emergency supplies, but agricultural specialists, terraforming experts, and economic advisors? What if you spent the time necessary to help them build sustainable, independent prosperity? Zephyros was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes distant. The military commanders would see it as a waste of imperial resources. The noble houses would wonder why I'm personally involving myself in such a minor system. But the Thylaxi would see it as salvation, Elena said softly. And word would spread. Other struggling worlds would start to believe that the Empire might actually care about their welfare, not just their tribute. A foundation of loyalty built on gratitude and genuine improvement rather than fear. Exactly. And when your military commanders question the approach, you can point to the results. A system that was barely contributing to the imperial economy becomes prosperous enough to increase their tribute voluntarily. A population that was resentful and potentially rebellious becomes genuinely loyal. Zephyros stood and walked to the window, looking out at the capital city spread below. It would be a significant risk. If something goes wrong, if the intervention fails, it could be seen as evidence that the old methods were better. Then, we make sure it doesn't fail, Elena said firmly. We plan carefully, we bring the right resources, and we stay until the job is done properly. Elena felt a moment of uncertainty. I assumed you would want me to accompany you, to help with the cultural aspects of the intervention, to make sure we're approaching things in ways that respect their values and customs. Elena, what I'm proposing isn't just advisory work. If we do this, you would be accompanying the most powerful military force in the galaxy to personally oversee the transformation of an entire star system. You would be visible to billions of Imperial citizens as someone with direct access to and influence over their emperor. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility? Elena thought about her former students, about the children from a dozen species she had taught to see beyond the boundaries of their own cultures. She thought about Lyralii, a little dragon who had dreamed of using her strength to help others. I'm prepared to try, she said. 3 weeks later, the Imperial fleet arrived in the Thylaxi system, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of the usual massive dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, Zephyros brought engineering vessels, agricultural ships, and medical frigates. The fleet that entered orbit around Thylaxi Prime was designed for construction rather than destruction. Elena stood on the observation deck of the flagship, watching as thousands of Imperial personnel deployed to the planet's surface. But these weren't soldiers. They were engineers, agricultural specialists, medical technicians, and infrastructure experts. The planetary governor seems confused, reported Commander Thrix, a veteran military officer who had served under Zephyros for over 4 centuries. He's requesting clarification on what tribute or service is expected in exchange for this assistance. Tell him there is no expected tribute, Zephyros said calmly. This is simply aid. Thrix's expression suggested he was having difficulty processing this concept. Sir, With respect, the governor will assume there's a hidden agenda. Planetary officials always assume there's a hidden agenda. Elena stepped forward. Then, we show him there isn't one. We demonstrate through our actions that this really is just help offered freely. The next few weeks were a revelation in what imperial power could accomplish when directed toward construction rather than conquest. Advanced terraforming technology restored the blighted agricultural areas within days. Medical teams eliminated disease strains that had plagued the population for generations. Engineering core built infrastructure that would support prosperity for centuries. But the real transformation came in the smaller interactions Elena witnessed throughout the operation. She watched Zephyros speak personally with Thylaxi farmers, asking detailed questions about their techniques and offering suggestions based on agricultural methods he had observed on dozens of worlds. She saw him spend an entire afternoon with a group of Thylaxi children who had been curious about dragons, telling them stories that made them laugh with delight rather than cower in fear. Most importantly, she observed the gradual change in how Imperial personnel began to see their emperor. Commander Thrix, who had initially been skeptical of the entire operation, approached Elena privately after the first week. "I've served under His Imperial Majesty for 400 years, Thrix said quietly. "I've seen him destroy armies, conquer worlds, and bring entire species to their knees. But I've never seen him happy before. Not like this." Elena looked across the command center to where Zephyros was consulting with a team of Thylaxi agricultural scientists about crop rotation strategies. There was an energy to his movements, an engagement in his voice that she hadn't seen before. "He's doing what he was meant to do," Elena said. "Dragons were guardians long before they were conquerors. This is what it looks like when he remembers that." "The change is remarkable," Thrix agreed. "And it's not just affecting him. The entire crew is performing better, working harder. There's a sense of purpose that wasn't there before." Elena nodded. She had noticed it too. The way Imperial personnel had begun taking pride in their engineering accomplishments rather than just their military victories, the way they spoke about the Thylaxi as partners rather than subjects. But the most significant moment came during the third week, when they received an unexpected communication from another star system. "Your Imperial Majesty," reported Communications Officer Vex, "we're receiving a priority message from the Zorthan Confederacy. They are requesting assistance." Elena and Zephyros exchanged glances. The Zorthan Confederacy was an independent system that had successfully resisted Imperial conquest for over 2 centuries. They were proud, fiercely independent, and had never before asked the Empire for anything. Their message is brief, but apparently they're facing some kind of ecological crisis. Multiple planets in their system are experiencing environmental collapse. They're asking if you would be willing to provide the same kind of aid you're giving to the Thylaxi. The silence on the bridge was profound. Elena could see the implications dawning on everyone present. Word of the Thylaxi intervention had spread so quickly and positively that even the Empire's enemies were willing to ask for help. "Prepare a response," Zephyros said finally. "Tell them we'll be there as soon as we finish our work here." After they transmitted the reply, Commander Thrix approached with an expression of amazement. "Sir, in my 4 centuries of service, I've never seen anything like this. The Zorthan Confederacy asking for Imperial aid voluntarily? It's unprecedented." "It's the beginning," Elena said quietly, and she saw Zephyros nod in agreement. Over the following months, the pattern repeated throughout the Empire. Worlds that had been maintained through fear began to experience genuine prosperity. Systems that had been rebellious became genuinely loyal. Most remarkably, independent systems that had never been part of the Empire began requesting voluntary inclusion, drawn by reports of Imperial aid that came without conquest or subjugation. But the real test came when Elena and Zephyros returned to the capital and faced the Imperial Court for the first time since beginning their new approach. The throne room was filled with military commanders, noble houses, and bureaucratic administrators, all of whom had noticed the changes in Imperial policy and had opinions about them. Elena stood beside the throne, her new position as cultural advisor lending her an authority she still wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Your Imperial Majesty," said Admiral Corex, the most senior military commander in the fleet, "while the recent humanitarian missions have certainly generated positive public relations, some of us are concerned about the strategic implications. Resources diverted to aid projects are resources not available for expansion and defense. Elena watched Zephyros carefully. This was the moment when the court would discover whether their emperor had genuinely changed or was simply experimenting with new tactics. "Admiral," Zephyros said calmly, "how would you assess the strategic value of the Zorthan Confederacy joining the Empire voluntarily rather than through conquest?" "Well, significant, obviously. Their industrial capacity and strategic location make them extremely valuable. But surely you're not suggesting that humanitarian aid is a viable strategy for expansion." "I'm suggesting that 3 months of engineering assistance accomplished what 2 centuries of military pressure could not," Zephyros replied. "The Zorthan system is now part of the Empire, contributing their full industrial capacity to our strength, and we gained their territory without losing a single ship or soldier." Elena could see the court beginning to process this information. The numbers were undeniable. The new approach was actually more effective than the old one, at least in certain circumstances. Furthermore, Zephyros continued, systems that join willingly require no occupation forces, generate no resistance movements, and contribute more enthusiastically to imperial goals. From a purely strategic standpoint, protection is more efficient than conquest. Lord Valdris, ever the careful administrator, raised a different concern. "Your Imperial Majesty, while the results are impressive, there are questions about precedent. If we continue to respond to every request for aid, we could find ourselves overwhelmed by demand from systems that see us as a source of charity rather than an authority to be respected." Elena stepped forward. "Lord Valdris raises an important point about resource management. That's why we've been developing criteria for intervention, focusing on situations where our aid can create long-term stability and prosperity rather than just temporary relief." She activated a holographic display showing data from their recent operations. Systems that receive this kind of comprehensive assistance show increased economic productivity, decreased rebellion activity, and higher voluntary tribute contributions. The return on investment is actually superior to traditional conquest in most cases. The debate continued for several hours, but Elena could see that they were winning. The court might not understand or approve of the emotional motivations behind the new approach, but they couldn't argue with the practical results. As the session ended and the court dispersed, Admiral Corex approached them privately. "Your Imperial Majesty, I admit I was skeptical of these changes initially, but the strategic advantages are becoming clear. I have one question, though. Is this a permanent shift in imperial policy or a temporary tactical adaptation?" Zephyros looked at the Admiral for a long moment, then at Elena. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Admiral, for 3,000 years I built an empire through fear and conquest. It made me powerful, but it also made me empty. I've recently been reminded that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves, from building rather than destroying, from creating loyalty through service rather than demanding it through force." He paused, looking out the great windows of the throne room toward the stars beyond. "This is not a tactical adaptation, Admiral. This is who I choose to be from now on. This is the empire I want to leave behind, one that my daughter would have been proud to inherit." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she heard him speak Lyraliai's name openly, in front of his senior officers, for the first time in 3 millennia. Admiral Corex nodded slowly. "Then, I serve willingly, Your Imperial Majesty. As do we all." That night, Elena stood in the Emperor's private quarters, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. The sound of weeping no longer drifted down from the tower above. Instead, there was something else, the sound of someone working late into the night, planning new missions of aid and protection, dreaming of an empire that could heal instead of harm. "Elena," came Zephyros's voice from behind her. She turned to see him holding something small and precious, Lyraliai's doll. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, "about honoring her by becoming the ruler she would have wanted me to be, and I think she would be proud of what we're building. This empire of protection instead of conquest. This use of strength to help rather than dominate." He looked down at the small doll in his massive hands. "For the first time in 3,000 years, I think I'm becoming someone worthy of her love." Elena smiled through her tears. She always loved you, Your Imperial Majesty. You're just finally learning to love yourself. Outside, the stars shone down on an empire in transformation, on fleets being retrofitted for construction rather than destruction, on worlds learning to trust rather than fear, on countless beings discovering that sometimes broken things really could be healed. And, in the highest tower of the Obsidian Palace, a dragon who had wept every night for 3 millennia finally began to dream of hope. 5 years after Elena first heard the sound of weeping from the highest tower, the Zephyrian Empire had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a military superpower that used its strength primarily for protection and aid rather than conquest. The transformation hadn't been without challenges, but the results spoke for themselves. Elena stood in what had once been the Emperor's War Room, now converted into a humanitarian coordination center. Holographic displays showed not troop movements and conquest targets, but disaster relief operations, agricultural development projects, and diplomatic missions throughout the galaxy. The room buzzed with activity as coordinators planned responses to requests for aid that arrived daily from across known space. Cultural Advisor Martinez called Commander Thrix, who had been promoted to Director of Humanitarian Operations. We have 17 new requests for assistance this week. 2 natural disasters, 3 disease outbreaks, 8 economic development projects, and 4 requests for mediation in territorial disputes. Elena reviewed the data on her personal display. The disease outbreaks take priority, as always. Deploy medical fleets to Hegemony 7 and Kelther Prime immediately. The territorial disputes, let's handle those through our new diplomatic corps. And the development projects, I'll take those personally, came a familiar voice from behind her. Elena turned to see Emperor Zephyros approaching, but the transformation in him was so complete that sometimes she still felt surprised. Gone was the exhausted, grief-stricken tyrant she had first encountered. In his place stood someone who radiated purpose and contentment. He still carried the weight of millennia and the power to level mountains, but now those qualities serve hope rather than despair. Your Imperial Majesty, Elena said formally. They maintained proper protocol in public settings, despite their friendship. Elena, he replied with a slight smile that would have been impossible 5 years ago. I wanted to discuss the Meridian Cluster situation personally. They're requesting assistance with a generational problem. Their youth population is becoming increasingly restless, and some planetary governments are struggling to provide meaningful opportunities. Elena pulled up the relevant files. It's a complex situation. 8 systems with rapidly growing populations but limited economic expansion. The traditional imperial response would have been to recruit their excess population for military service, which would have solved the short-term problem while creating long-term resentment, Zephyros noted. What are you thinking instead? Educational exchange programs, infrastructure development projects that require significant workforce involvement. Maybe even some of our new colony seeding initiatives give their young people the chance to explore and settle in unclaimed systems with imperial support and protection. I like it. It addresses their immediate needs while potentially expanding the empire through voluntary participation rather than conquest. He paused, looking at the displays around them. Have I mentioned recently how proud I am of what we've built here? Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. Only about once a week, Your Imperial Majesty. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication alert. Admiral Corex's face appeared on the main display, and his expression was grim. Your Imperial Majesty, we have a priority situation developing in the Outer Rim. The Hejira Consortium is mounting a military campaign against several independent systems in the Vega sector. Our intelligence suggests they're targeting worlds that have recently requested Imperial protection. Elena felt her stomach tighten. This was the kind of challenge they had always known would come eventually, a direct military threat to their new approach to governance. What's the scale of the consortium force? Zephyros asked. Substantial. 3 full battle fleets. Approximately 2,000 ships total. They're moving systematically through the sector, issuing ultimatums to each system. Submit to consortium rule or face bombardment. And our assets in the region? The 5th Humanitarian Fleet is currently in the area, but they're equipped for 8 operations, not military engagement. We could have the 3rd and 7th battle fleets there within 4 days, but if we respond with military force, we risk validating claims that our humanitarian missions are just cover for Imperial expansion, Elena finished. Exactly. The Consortium is almost certainly hoping to provoke us into a conventional military response that would undermine the diplomatic progress we've made with other independent systems. Zephyros was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes distant. Elena could practically see him weighing options, considering consequences, thinking through strategies that might preserve both the threatened worlds and the Empire's reputation. Admiral, what's the current status of the threatened systems? Are they capable of defending themselves? Negative, Your Imperial Majesty. These are peaceful worlds with minimal military capacity. They joined our protection network precisely because they couldn't defend against this kind of aggression. Elena stepped forward. Your Imperial Majesty, what if we don't respond with a conventional military campaign? What if we try something different? What did you have in mind? The Consortium is betting that we'll either abandon our allies or revert to our old military approach. What if we do neither? What if we demonstrate that protection can be more powerful than aggression? She moved to the strategic display, highlighting the relevant systems. The Consortium forces are spread across multiple targets, trying to intimidate through overwhelming show of force. But they're also vulnerable to the kind of coordinated response that our humanitarian network makes possible. Go on. Instead of engaging them militarily, we evacuate the civilian populations of the threatened worlds temporarily while simultaneously launching aid operations to every system in Consortium space that's suffering under their rule. We make it clear that while they're destroying, we're building. While they're conquering, we're liberating. Admiral Corex looked skeptical. Cultural advisor, with respect, military force still requires military response. We can't shield entire star systems with humanitarian aid. We don't shield them with aid, Elena replied. We shield them with the truth. We document everything the Consortium does to those worlds and broadcast it across the galaxy. We show what conquest looks like compared to protection, and we make sure that every being in Consortium space knows that the Empire offers a better alternative. Zephyros was nodding slowly. A propaganda war fought with actual results instead of just words. We demonstrate our values through action while forcing them to demonstrate theirs. Exactly. And meanwhile, we prepare for the possibility that they might escalate to direct confrontation with Imperial forces. If they want a military engagement, we give them one, but on our terms in defense of people we're genuinely protecting. The debate continued for several hours, with military advisors arguing for traditional responses and civilian coordinators supporting Elena's approach. In the end, it was a communication from one of the threatened systems that decided the matter. Your Imperial Majesty, reported Communications Officer Vex, we're receiving a message from the Planetary Council of Kepler's Hope. They're thanking us for the aid we provided during their agricultural crisis last year, and they're saying they trust you to find a solution that doesn't require them to become a battlefield. Elena watched Zephyros's expression as he processed this. Here was a world facing imminent bombardment, and instead of demanding immediate military protection, they were expressing faith in his ability to find a better way. Admiral Corex, he said finally, begin immediate evacuation operations for all threatened civilian populations. I want them relocated to safe systems within 48 hours. Yes, Your Imperial Majesty. Cultural Advisor Martinez, initiate your information campaign immediately. I want detailed documentation of Consortium military actions broadcast across every available channel. Make sure the galaxy sees exactly what kind of liberation the Consortium offers. Understood. And prepare the 1st and 2nd battle fleets for deployment. If the Consortium wants to test whether our compassion makes us weak, they're about to discover that protecting others actually makes us stronger. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything in the Empire's history. Instead of a conventional war, they fought a battle for the moral high ground of the galaxy. Imperial forces evacuated over 50 million civilians from threatened worlds while simultaneously launching aid operations to every Consortium-controlled system where populations were suffering under authoritarian rule. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Consortium forces destroyed infrastructure and bombarded empty cities in a futile attempt to intimidate populations that were already safe. Imperial forces built schools, hospitals, and communication networks on worlds that had been isolated under consortium rule. Elena worked nearly around the clock, coordinating both the evacuation operations and the information campaign that was documenting everything for the galactic community. The response was overwhelming. Independent systems that had been neutral in galactic politics began openly supporting the Empire's position. But the turning point came when Consortium Admiral Voss made a critical mistake. Frustrated by the Empire's non-military response, he ordered the bombardment of a hospital ship that was evacuating wounded civilians from a contested world. The attack was broadcast live across the galaxy. Elena watched the recordings in the coordination center, feeling sick. The hospital ship had been clearly marked, following all accepted protocols for civilian evacuation. There was no possible military justification for the attack. "Broadcast this everywhere," she told the communications team. "Every system, every network, every available channel. I want every being in the galaxy to see what the consortium thinks of civilian protections." The reaction was swift and devastating for the consortium. Independent systems that had been considering consortium membership began withdrawing from negotiations. Consortium member worlds started experiencing internal rebellion as their populations saw what their government was willing to do. Most importantly, the Hegemony Republic, the consortium's primary ally, publicly condemned the hospital ship attack and withdrew their support for the military campaign. Within a week, consortium forces began retreating from the Vega sector. Within 2 weeks, Admiral Voss was facing mutiny from his own officers who refused to participate in what had become a galactic public relations disaster. The war ended not with a climactic battle, but with the consortium requesting mediation talks to end their international isolation. Elena stood in the observation deck of the flagship Lyraliai's Hope, named in honor of the Emperor's daughter, watching as consortium representatives prepared to board for surrender negotiations. The sight would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The galaxy's most powerful military empire winning a war without firing a shot, simply by demonstrating that protection was more powerful than aggression. "You realize what we've accomplished here," Zephyros said, joining her at the observation windows. "We've proven that your daughter's vision was correct," Elena replied. "That strength used to help others is more powerful than strength used to dominate them. More than that, we've changed what it means to be an empire. We've shown the galaxy that military power can be used to build instead of destroy, to protect instead of conquer."